Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the module DD316 Modern Political Ideas, page 46. The generators of ideas. First, remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Secondly, the remains of aristocratical tyranny in the person of the peers. Thirdly, the new republican materials in the persons of the commons, on whose virtues depends the freedom of England, mentioned in Paine 1776. On England's relationship with America, he had this to say: Europe is too thickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace. Whenever war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection with Britain. The next war may not turn out like the last, and should it not, the advocates of reconciliation now will be wishing for separation then, because neutrality in that case would be a safer convoy than a man of war. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Paine's style and language made his ideas receptive to readers, and his popular pamphlet was quickly distributed among a wide audience. Therefore, we can say that the crucial factor for the work's popularity was the way in which he disseminated his ideas. This helped by the movements and individuals who shared them, and the new spaces opening up for dissent. As events took hold, as events unfolded, he published another pamphlet series, The American Crisis, which contained an appeal to the American people to end the tyrannical rule of the British. This pamphlet was endorsed and promoted by George Washington, among others. After working for the American Foreign Ministry in the late 1780s, Paine returned to London, where he joined a radical circle of thinkers and writers included William Goodwin and William Blake and others, who welcomed the French Revolution in 1789. In the aftermath of that revolution and the ensuing debates among supporters and critics, Paine wrote his most famous work, Rights of Man, Paine 1791, not as a pamphlet but as a longer philosophical work, which was partly a response to Edmund Burke's major critic of the French Revolution, Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which Burke set out the foundations of modern conservatism. Rights of Man also sold well, but when the following year Paine published Rights of Man, the part a second, combining principle and practice, Paine 1792, which made the case for representative government and progressive taxation. He was issued with a writ for seditious libel, and the book was removed from circulation. He was targeted by government officials and agents and had to leave the country. The publication of the book and the response of the government to Paine and his supporters led to negative reaction from hostile mobs and police actions, as well as more pamphlets from sympathetic clubs and societies who want to take his ideas further. Following the writ for sedition, Paine escaped to France. Then, in those throes of revolution, where he was awarded honorary citizenship on account of his work and even elected to the National Convention before failing foul of Maximilien Robespierre's regime. Paine's and his supporters' pamphleteering was an early example of disseminating ideas to a large public before the emergence of representative democracy and political parties. It illustrates the varied nature of ideas, a mixture of theoretic and polemic in common sense, and more profound philosophy in Rights of Man. It also provides an interesting example of how ideas travel across time and place and live through their application in different contexts, including quite two malicious events. Paine's ideas were at different times celebrated, proclaimed, contested, banned, quoted, and misquoted, distorted, and reapplied. Subsequently, they have influenced politics in South America and elsewhere, as well as find their way into the reading lists of politics students. Other aspects of his thought have been reassessed in esteemed academic journals. Chapter 3: The Generator of Ideas. The Permeters and policymakers. The link between Paine's ideas and political change is evident. However, the impact of political ideas often work in less public and more nuanced ways than some of the settings in which Paine and his supporters and other radical dissidents found themselves in this regard. The work of the Fabian social reformers Sidney and Beatrice Webb in the UK provides a quite different example of the way ideas are generated and disseminated. In their own words, they were a professional as well as a personal partnership, producing reports with the aim of developing or influencing policy. During a partnership of over 50 years, they produced between them scores of reports, sat on a range of committees and commissions, helped found the London School of Economics and the New Statesman, and were prominent members of the Fabian Society, one of the oldest political organisations which promotes an idea of socialism through gradual reform rather than radical political change. The gradualism they and the Fabian Society espoused was based on developing policy ideas that were supported by empirical evidence and the use of experts, people like themselves. The infrastructure of modern societies, including the civil service, bureaucracy, the apparatus of modern taste, modern state, and mass political parties competing in liberal democracy would provide the vehicles for change, providing that these institutions functioned effectively. There was no need for radical agitation from below. This reflects the view of the Webbs and other social reformers that pragmatic reforms could be introduced gradually and were preferable to ideological change, which might threaten to overthrow core institutions. Their approach was also predicted on the view that there was no need for citizens to be mobilized or galvanized to action. They believed that capitalism could be modified and even transformed through extending the role of the state, its collectivist arms, like education and welfare, so that they serve common social goals rather than private interests. Early in her career, Beatrice Webb worked on life and labour of the people in London. Charles Booth's vast study of poverty in the city, collecting evidence on slum housing and monitoring social conditions. She is also a member of the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws and Relief of Distress and contributed to a Minority Report, widely thought to be one of the early arguments for a full welfare state. Sidney Webb was a significant figure in the early days of Labour. Partly, and wrote famous clause, the sixth of its constitution, which set out some of its core values. He was later a Labour MP and government minister and subsequently a member of the House of Lords. The Webb's faith in planned economy achieved some notoriety later in their lives when they co-authored the book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, which praised the achievements of the Soviet Union and is inspired in particular by the regime's 5-year plans. The Fabian model endorsed by the Webbs suggested that political ideas were most effective when they permeated the institutions of the state and helped direct the social development. Its critics argue that this is a top-down and hierarchical concept of change, heavily reliant on experts and leaders, and overly optimistic of what can be achieved by the state. The Webbs believe in the experts might have been strengthened by their own membership. of various influential circles and family connections to other politicians and public figures. However, it was a deliberate strategy of permission which underpinned their approach and which differed sharply from the polarisation favoured by other social movements or parties, as Beatrice Webb explained in W. H. Greenleaf, The British Political Tradition, Volume 2, 1983. What bound us together as associates was our common faith in deliberately organised society, our common belief in application of science to human relations with a view to betterment. We stalked our hopes on to organised working class, served and guided, it is true, by an elite of unassuming experts who could make no claim to superior social status but would content themselves with exercising the power inherent in their super knowledge and longer administrative experience. This is mentioned in Greenleaf 1983, page 401 to 402. Page 50. The propagandist. Radio became a powerful force for transmission of political ideas from 1920s and 1930s, both as a new medium for airing viewpoints and as a propaganda tool for regimes that sought to impose authority or manufacture consent. The BBC was founded in 1922 as the British Broadcasting Company and developed into a public service broadcaster strongly influenced by the ideas of its founder, director, General Sir John Reeve, who placed a strong influence on education and moral direction, partly as a way to avoid the American style of entertainment broadcasting that was driven by advertising, which was not permitted by the BBC. His mission for the BBC was that it would educate as well as mainstream entertain the public. He also thought a public service broadcaster, initially radio unit, the first TV broadcast in 1936, should have the purpose of promoting peace between nations, a rather lofty ideal, while providing space for a variety of political opinions from its inception, and notably from its first Royal Charter in 1927. When it became the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC had to balance the competing claims of national interest and editorial independence, as well as ensuring it offered a variety of opinions. Nevertheless, radio was regarded with optimism by broadcasting providers who thought it would improve cooperation between governments and bring social stability for its citizens. The BBC, along with its broadcasting rivals, helped to establish the media as an important, if contested, vehicle for disseminating ideas in liberal democracies which depend on free expression and the separation of powers within the state. It would become a central component of pluralism. However, for totalitarian regimes, which depend on state that centralizes power, controls the circulation of public opinion, and demands for subservience to the dominant party and leader, radio took on a different meaning during the 1920s. Film and radio had been used by the states of both Italian fascism and Soviet communism. It keen to make the most of an expanding technological apparatus to impose their ideological and discredit political opponents. This reflected the capacity of totalitarian regimes to use the apparatus of modern state for propaganda purpose. In the Soviet Union, Radio Moscow, which broadcasted from 1929 to the end of the Cold War, transmitted broadcasters in the different languages by native speakers in order to reach potential sympathizers and to put across a rose-tinted view of the regime across central continents. One of the reasons Italian fascism grew in the 1920s as one of the first mass political movements was the effective use it made of the new mass medium, along with film, not only in broadcasting Benito Mussolini's speeches to put public squares, but also using it to build a community of activist supporters. German Nazi regime built radio towers for the 1936 Berlin Olympics, powerful enough to transmit news of the games in 47 languages across the globe. According to David Sarnoff, head of the Radio Corporation of America, Nazi towers were the most potent agency for the dissemination of political doctrine that the world was known. Poet 2018. It also, if radio propaganda was at its most extreme under totalitarianism, it also becomes significant at certain moments in liberal democracy, notably in times of war. The importance given to radio at these times is reflected in the tension relationship between the BBC, which from its outset had maintained editorial control over the programmes as it does today, and the wartime government, which was committed to maintaining national security. The nature of war reported was transformed during the Second World War. With one grounded footage and contemporary provided by reporters like Richard Dimleby and Howard Marshall, sometimes these reports were the subject of controversy and debate, prompting such question as, for example, should the liberal democratic commitment to the truth be upheld at times of war? When the enemy will be able to get access to reports and information, or do questions of national security override such considerations? The dilemma became the concern of BBC editors, politicians, and the military on what was hitherto uncharted territory. For the first time in major conflicts, radio became an essential form of propaganda, an important communication channel as the battle of ideas took to the airwaves. The Second World War was the first time radio in the UK held a national audience, which meant that radio broadcasts began to usurp newspapers and as the first communication channels for news, with events such as the initial announcement of war, Dunkirk, the Blitz and D-Day landings, as well as Winston Churchill's speeches, reaching a wide national audience. But radio worked in more subtle ways too. It was a cultural medium and, just as reality and dangers of war were expressed through literature, film and art. In Picasso's Guernica, for example, which depicts the bombing of the town by Nazi Germany and the fascist Italy during the Spanish Civil War, radio had to engage and inspire its audience. The BBC's use of range of writers and intellectuals who were given the task of informing as well as educating and entertaining the audience illustrates the importance given to such work. In addition to his own broadcasting contributions, George Orwell was a BBC Talks producer, that is, a BBC employee who commissioned other writers between 1941 and 1943. Experience he later put to good use when describing the propaganda role of the Ministry of Truth in his book, 1984. It was further instanced by Britain's Ministry of Information, which was set up the day after war broke out and based in the formidable Senate House building in Bloomsbury, central London. The writer and playwright J.B. Presley had the most prominent role in BBC's subtle propaganda campaign. His 10-minute postscripts programme proved to be so popular as to warrant him an unofficial title of Voice of the Nation and an unlikely celebrity status among listeners. The programme was broadcast live after Sunday evening news bulletin, which was the then peak listening time, so that he could compete for Sunday night listeners with the more overt propaganda of William Joyce, a pro-Nazi Irishman, the so-called Lord Haw-Haw, who started his notorious but popular broadcast from Hamburg with the catchphrase "Germany calling, calling, calling Joyce," who was later executed for treason, had proved to be popular, if controversial, in his attempts to win over British public, and Presley was needed to match him from Staunton 2017. Presley's first broadcast was the Epic of Dunkirk, his contemporary on the evacuation of British troops from northern France in June 1940. He drew on the idealised view of the nation in making the connection between ordinary English values and the bigger questions facing the country, which he surmised amounted to snatching glory out of defeat. Extracts from his broadcast would appear in the following day's newspapers. There is, however, a significant myth attached to his broadcast, which provided a narrative based on romantic interpretation of English values combined with serious and comforting messages that truth and justice would prevail in the end. Priestley himself denied that the broadcasters were propaganda, rather that he proved some human insight to urgent question. The description of the Nazi enemy was couched in easily understandable terminology, preferred to treat it as a doctrine or ideology, but consisting of a mixture of failing human values. In postscript of 23 June 1940, entitled Dark Face of Nazi Germany, Priestley used the following term to describe Nazism: bullying, plotting, shouting, perverted and corrupt Nazi views were, he said, held by people who had not outgrown adolescence and were driven by a gang spirit. His early broadcasts were transmitted at a time when Britain faced a serious threat of invasion. But in later broadcasts, there was a shift in his focus from the need to resist an invader and considered what a future society might look like. He was He was strongly on the view that a fairer, more equal, and just society needed to be created to avoid pre-war squalor or to repeat the failure of the end of the First World War, to build a land for its heroes. Though his broadcasts remained popular, this renewed emphasis brought criticism from right-wing politicians who accused him of bringing too much politics into his broadcasts and put pressure on the BBC to take action. After returning from self-imposed break in late 1940, the new series of postscripts in 1941 was curtailed by the BBC after it suggested, among other things, the prevailing inequality, exploitation and snobbery would have to be addressed after the war. He questioned the wisdom of the decision, arguing despite his earlier ambivalence over the term. The propaganda was value of his postscripts would be missed. Political ideas in the era of post-truth. The pamphleteers, permeters, propagandists, and all indicative of different ways of disseminating political ideas. Of course, these are not exclusive. There are many other generators of ideas. Think, for example, of the philosopher who asks us to think about the consequences of our actions, the meanings and political applications of justice, or the usefulness of philosophical traditions in helping us to think about contemporary dilemmas, or the orator able to rouse and influence an audience through a selective use of language and emotion in speeches and debates. Governments themselves can also set the agenda of political debate and are starved by an increasing number of advisors or spin doctors who decide which sound bites, popular words or phrases will be most effective in presenting an argument, influence the press, or wooing the public in Western liberal democracies like the UK or the US. The generators of ideas are supposed to be given free rein, yet there are always some restrictions on free speech. This might include perceived hate speech or forms of incitement to violence. Since 2016 in particular, debates on free speech have grown through a number of cases where speeches planned in universities and elsewhere have been cancelled or changed. This has fueled a further debate on so-called political correctness, that is, whether some views or speakers are prevented from being heard because they challenge the views of an elite. It also opened the debate on the context to which ideas said to be offensive should be tolerated. The phrase, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," often attributed by Voltaire, though in fact used by one of his biographers, have been revived in light of these debates as contending arguments over tolerance and limits of free speech have returned. Clear connections can be made between the pamphleteers and later political activists and social movements who sought to campaign and argue for social change in different contexts and under different political systems. This might broadly be called ideological struggle, in which ideas about how to change society, the meaning of freedom, or what should be the limits of immigration, are taken up by activists and movements in a popular form or a campaign that reaches out to a wider public. Interestingly, Paine himself could be seen as both. An ideologue as the author of the common sense and as a philosopher who formulated ideas of sovereignty and the individual liberal rights of man. Permeters and public makers belong to a long tradition which continues to generate political ideas, often understated in comparison to more ideological proponents. The reformists put more emphasis on pragmatic and gradual change. This is an approach which has extended across different political traditions to include, in the UK, liberal reforms of John Maynard Keynes and William Beveridge, which helped to shape the post-war economy and welfare system, conservative reformers who proposed social change based on modifying existing institutions, and social democratic reformers in the Labour Party. The adheres to the earlier Fabian tradition. Aside from politicians' think tanks, pressure groups, and research bodies are also generators of ideas introduced by policymakers to support legislation. The scope for propagandists, which widened considerably through the global media, and governments pay enormous amount of attention to its possibilities and pitfalls. Even if the ability to control or constrain the circulation of ideas has been severely reduced, today's propagandists are more sophisticated in their use of the media. And politics itself has become increasingly driven by what might be seen as gentle propaganda. Following the rapid development of satellite and digital media platforms, social media has been the most significant vehicle for propaganda, with its spontaneous, semi-anarchic format, normally out of control of governments except in tightly constrained regimes which rely on censorship. Indeed, the extent to which propagandist ideas are generated and shared has challenged long held assumptions, and ideas influence political debate and had raised questions about whether truth and transparency of politics, where, for example, political leaders and representatives are held to the account, can survive these developments. The rise of populism has amplified some of these concerns. Populism has simplified politics, and the way in which populist leaders now address the people has been enhanced through the growth of new technology. The extent of populist appeal since 2007 and 8, and notably since 2016, has threatened to call into question the way in which we have traditionally understood the role ideas have in politics, whether as ideologies or as concepts with clear meanings. Post-truth has been the term used by some, for example, D. Anconia 2017, Davis 2010, to explain how in political discourse emotional arguments take precedence. Leave it there, ladies and gents. Page 56. Page 56. Lovely job.